Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Louisiana Wind Week. My name is Harry Vorhoff, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Governor's Office of Coastal Activities and serve as the Governor's primary point of contact to work with the United States Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, on its Gulf of Mexico Intergovernmental Renewable Energy Task Force and coordinate the involvement of state agencies and local and tribal governments on that task force. We're excited you can join us this morning to learn about the offshore wind lease process, both in state and federal waters, as well as how offshore wind is a priority for both the Edwards and Biden administrations. We're very appreciative to have with us today BOEM Director Amanda Lefton, as well as BOEM's Gulf of Mexico Regional Office Director Michael Salata, to go over offshore wind priorities and policy efforts and to go over the lease process. They will then take Q&A from the attendees. After we hear from BOEM, Louisiana Department of Natural Resources Secretary Tom Harris and his staff attorneys, Jim Devitt and Greg Roberts, will go over priorities, regulatory oversight, and the leasing process from a state perspective. We'll then open it up for Q&A with DNR. Louisiana Economic Development Secretary Don Pearson will close out the scheduled remarks by addressing the economic development potential of offshore wind and the programs and incentives that it has available to help develop local industry and help bend the national cost curve to create more affordable offshore wind energy. We will then close out the day with a final Q&A and public comment. In order to participate in the Q&A and public comment, you can either type your questions into the chat, or if you want to speak your comment or question, you can click the raise hand button located under the reactions on the lower part of your screen. And we will unmute you to ask your question at the appropriate time. But first, an opening message from Governor John Bel Edwards to kick off Louisiana Wind Week.
Good morning, and welcome to Louisiana Wind Week. I'm glad you can join us as we take our first steps toward developing offshore wind energy in the Gulf of Mexico while expanding Louisiana's role in this rapidly expanding sector of the economy. Thank you to President Biden, Interior Secretary Holland, and BOEM Director Lefton for their leadership, as well as BOEM's Gulf of Mexico Regional Director, Michael Salata. There is no better example of how improving the environment and economy go hand in hand than offshore wind development. For decades, the Gulf has been vital to the nation's energy security and independence while supplying jobs and revenues. As we look to the future, I want the Gulf of Louisiana to remain essential to the country's energy story while also doing our part to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. This is why I am committed to putting policies in place and planning mechanisms that address greenhouse gas emissions in a major and sustaining way in our state. Just last year, by executive order, I established a Climate Initiatives Task Force and pledged getting our state to the goal of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. As we examine the future of wind energy development in the Gulf of Mexico and its role in getting us to net zero, I want to underscore the crucial role offshore energy production currently plays in Louisiana's coastal adaptation efforts. Since 2006, impact assistance funds through GOMESA that are generated from oil and gas activity on the Outer Continental Shelf amount to the state's largest recurring source of federal climate adaptation and pre-disaster mitigation funding. With offshore wind energy development gearing up across all of our nation's coasts, I encourage you all to support the enactment of the RISE Act by Senator Cassidy and Senator Whitehouse, because I believe that every state affected by federal energy development should receive fair and appropriate impact assistance. In closing, I recognize that our nation is in the early stages of a profound transition in our energy mix. I also recognize that climate change is a real problem that must not be ignored any longer. I am committed to addressing these issues so that we are positioned to thrive today and for decades to come. And for those reasons, Louisiana is all in on offshore wind. Enjoy Louisiana Wind Week. Thank you, and God bless.
Thank you, Governor. As the governor highlighted just now, he made addressing the root cause of climate change a second-term coastal priority. In his climate executive order signed last year, the governor stated that to improve our resilience, sustain our coast, and help avoid the worst impacts of climate change, Louisiana must proactively work to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. The governor's approach to addressing greenhouse gas emissions has been focused on capturing as many co-benefits as possible, like improving the health and welfare of our communities, restoring and protecting our coast, and advancing our economic and energy profile, all while reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. The governor's climate task force is still in the middle of its 14-month planning effort to develop a climate action plan, but will have draft actions by this fall and approve a final plan by February 1st of next year. While that work is ongoing, based on the conversations thus far, renewables like offshore wind will play an important role in getting to net zero by 2050. And we will take a hard look at how we can promote the deployment of renewables in Louisiana and off its coast. To that end, since last year, the governor's office has been working closely with Louisiana Department of Economic Development, the Department of Natural Resources, BOEM, and others to facilitate the development of offshore wind energy in the Gulf of Mexico, like requesting that BOEM stand up the Intergovernmental Renewable Energy Task Force for the Gulf of Mexico. Through this coordination, we discussed the benefit of amplifying and bolstering BOEM's Renewable Energy Task Force and pairing it with additional focus on Louisiana's supply chain capacity, existing stakeholders, and leasing in state waters. And with that, the idea of Louisiana Wind Week was born. The goal of Louisiana Wind Week is to build off last week's BOEM Task Force meeting and discuss opportunities and concerns among a variety of perspectives. These discussions will hopefully increase participation in BOEM's recent request for interest on wind energy development in the Gulf of Mexico, the deadline of which to submit comments is next month on July 26th. And to be clear, Wind Week is not an official forum for commenting on the RFI, so you need to go to the BOEM website or the Federal Register website to get instructions on how to make an official comment. But with that disclaimer, we are hoping that this week is a week of sharing ideas, opportunities, and concerns across not only governments and agencies, but also, and perhaps more importantly, among stakeholders and the public. Because the sooner we understand and work through these concerns and opportunities, the sooner we can get turbines in the water and enjoy the economic, social, and climate benefits of offshore wind energy. And with that, I'd like to introduce BOEM Director Amanda Lefton to share some thoughts on the potential for offshore wind development in the Gulf of Mexico and how it fits into the priorities of the Biden administration. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and welcome Amanda Lefton, Director Lefton. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me here today. As already noted, my name's Amanda Lefton. I'm the Director of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM. And on behalf of the entire Department of the Interior, thank you for inviting me here to speak today. I'm so excited to be with you for the first ever Louisiana Wind Week. And in fact, today's event, or this week's event, really is another first for renewable energy in the Gulf. As noted already, last Tuesday, BOEM hosted the inaugural Gulf of Mexico Intergovernmental Renewable Energy Task Force. And I'd like to thank Regional Director Mike Salata for his great leadership in putting that together. Last fall, Governor John Bell Edwards asked BOEM to convene a regional task force to advance offshore wind in the Gulf of Mexico. His office is also, of course, responsible for hosting Louisiana Wind Week today and throughout the week, and I'd really like to thank him for his initiative and leadership on advancing opportunities for renewable energy in the Gulf of Mexico. And it was great to hear his wonderful opening remarks this morning. I trust that what you will accomplish this week will build on the foundations the task force began to lay to explore opportunities for clean energy in the Gulf of Mexico. We're so pleased to be a part of this important effort. Biden-Harris administration has made significant progress to advance its ambitious plans to confront climate change, create good-paying jobs, and begin the nation's transition to a cleaner energy future. I'm so excited to discuss the federal strategic vision for the U.S. offshore wind industry and the department's role in advancing these efforts. I'd like to start by sharing BOEM's vision and mission for offshore wind. First, we are driven by the need to act on climate change. We must transition to a clean energy future and know that offshore wind can play a critical role in meeting the country's energy needs. Second, when we think about climate, we think about jobs. Offshore wind can create thousands of good-paying jobs and contribute to our local economy and create a robust supply chain in the United States, especially here in the Gulf of Mexico. Third, we need to develop offshore wind responsibly. And this includes avoiding impacts to ocean users and the marine environment and relying on the best available science. Fourth, we must robustly engage tribal nations and ocean users throughout the process. And finally, we need a smart and transparent process and are working to provide greater certainty to the industry and stakeholders alike. The climate crisis is a centerpiece of the president's agenda. Developing offshore wind in the United States will help address the threats of climate change and create thousands of good-paying jobs. This spring, the Department of Interior, along with the Departments of Commerce and Energy, came together to set an administration goal to deploy 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, which will create nearly 80,000 jobs. BOEM is playing a critical role to implement the White House strategy, and to date, we have leased 1.7 million acres of the OCS. We have completed 17 commercial leases on the Atlantic and plan to advance new lease sales and complete the review of at least 16 construction and operations plan by 2025. And just to ground that a little bit, those construction and operation plans represent more than 19 gigawatts of new clean energy for the nation. The administration is committed to renewable energy, and that's really reflected in our recent budget. The fiscal year 2022 budget proposes additional funding in support of stakeholder engagement, science, and of course staffing to increase BOEM's capacity to help facilitate the nation's transition to a cleaner energy sources that are both safe and environmentally sound. The budget also supports growing the offshore wind industry in a manner that supports disadvantaged or underserved communities. The Department of the Interior and BOEM are committed to responsibly growing the industry to reap the benefits of clean energy and job creation, particularly in those underserved communities. And as you can imagine, we've been very busy implementing this strategy. And just to give you a sense of some of the accomplishments to date under the Biden-Harris administration, first in May, BOEM took a historic first step and approved the nation's first commercial scale offshore wind project. The 800 megawatt Vineyard Wind Energy Project alone will create 3,600 jobs. In addition, we've made significant progress on identifying wind energy areas on the East and the West Coasts. We recently advanced the proposed sale notice for the New York Bight, which is 800 acres between New York and New Jersey. And this notice can meet up to 8 new lease areas. We're also exploring potential areas offshore California and the Carolinas. And our work to date and our strong partnerships with other agencies demonstrate a sea change for the offshore wind industry. We are taking a government-wide approach that will catalyze the industry. The climate crisis presents dire challenges, and there's no room for delay. But our desire to move forward will not outpace our steadfast commitment to do this right. We are working to create greater certainty for the industry, state and local governments, tribal nations, ocean users, and other partners and stakeholders. We need to advance both an efficient and effective process for reviewing plans to develop existing leases and an inclusive and expeditious process for identifying areas for potential future lease sales. We're also committed to improving our relationship with tribal governments and will continue to prioritize protecting marine ecosystems and advanced science and monitoring to guide our decisions. Importantly, I truly believe, as I'm sure many people here do today, that the Gulf in particular is well positioned to transition to a renewable energy future. Approximately 50 million acres in the Gulf of Mexico is under consideration for renewable energy development, with Louisiana and Texas having some of the highest wind capacity in the Gulf. The region's oil and gas industry has the ability and the experience to play an integral role in the nation's transition to clean energy. The Gulf truly has the know-how for energy development in the OCS. With its mature industrial base and long history of offshore energy development, this region has the know-how, experienced workforce, and innovative thinking that can drive new and exciting developments. In fact, BOEM released a request for information, and I encourage respondents to think creatively and innovatively about the unique opportunities for clean energy here in the Gulf. I know many of these possibilities were discussed last week and really encourage thoughtful responses to that RFI that is on the street now that was mentioned previously. We also realize how important both commercial and recreational fishing industries are in the Gulf. That's why we're committed to working to further engage the commercial fishing industry. And I'll say that fortunately, oil and gas development has coexisted with this industry for many years, and we intend to use those lessons learned from that relationship as we develop renewable energy. And broadly, outreach and public engagement are critical components in BOEM's renewable energy development process. That's why we're taking a regional approach to stakeholder engagement, and we've convened several intergovernmental renewable energy task forces around the country to coordinate planning, solicit feedback, and exchange information. And of course, the Gulf of Mexico held its first task force meeting last week, drawing federal, state, local, and tribal elected officials and government representatives from Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi, and Alabama. And participants learned about the offshore wind development process in federal waters and provided us with valuable input. I look forward to seeing this task force grow and mature as we move forward. Just a note, you may have heard last week about a decision regarding the pause on new oil and gas leasing under Executive Order 14008. BOEM will comply with the federal judge's order to stop the implementation of the pause. And in the meantime, we're here to really continue our focus on BOEM's offshore wind goals and specifically what role that can play in the Gulf of Mexico. Because we know there's no doubt that the climate crisis is before us now. Transitioning to clean energy is critical to help the US tackle this issue. In its first 5 months in office, the Biden-Harris administration has catalyzed the offshore wind industry, generating a roadmap that will help the industry create tens of thousands of jobs while combating the negative effects of climate change. But the full environmental and economic benefits of offshore energy can only be realized if we all come together to ensure that all potential development is considered and advanced responsibly. The Gulf of Mexico region has unique expertise and infrastructure that can play a significant role in advancing innovative solutions as part of this transition. I have no doubt that offshore wind can become a beneficial and complementary component of Louisiana's energy future. And BOEM looks forward to working with everyone here as we advance the administration's climate goals and renewable energy goals and help create a cleaner, more equitable energy future for our nation. Thanks so much. I'll turn it over back to you.
Thank you, Director Lefton. Really appreciate BOEM's presence down here in the Gulf, ongoing presence, and really this priority of offshore wind development is very exciting. And thank you for providing these updates to the audience. Up next, we will have Mike Salata, Regional Director for BOEM for the Gulf of Mexico region.
Good morning. I'm Mike Salata, Gulf of Mexico Regional Director for Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM. I want to thank Governor Edwards, his team, Harry, especially for the invitation to be here today. And thank Governor Edwards and Director Lefton for their leadership on offshore wind development in the Gulf of Mexico. I'm excited about the potential for offshore renewable energy in the Gulf of Mexico. As Amanda indicated, BOEM recently issued a request for information, RFI, seeking public input on renewable energy development in the Gulf. And BOEM held its inaugural meeting of the Gulf of Mexico Intergovernmental Renewable Energy Task Force last Tuesday. The meeting was to jumpstart collaboration with tribes, states, local governments, and federal partners. The meeting had over 400 participants, people like you and me who want to expand the clean energy landscape in the Gulf of Mexico. So what is the potential? BOEM has funded studies with the National Renewable Energy Lab, Nrel, to help answer this question. Published in 2020, the technical assessment, so we assessed solar, wave, tidal, ocean current, ocean thermal energy conversion, and even hydrogen for their technical potential. And wind, but by far, had the highest technical potential with 508 gigawatts covering all GOEM states, with Texas and Louisiana showing the highest overall technical offshore wind resource potential. Gulf Coast itself, the whole Gulf combined, compromises 32% of the shallow water offshore wind potential in the US. So there's tremendous potential for wind and renewable energy in the Gulf based on these studies. But as Director Lefton mentioned and also stated, the Atlantic has 17 commercial leases in the Atlantic. So the Gulf is, it's kind of, we're a step or two behind here. But the Gulf clearly has some advantages in pursuing wind and renewable energy. As the director said, the Gulf of Mexico's oil and gas industries has the skills and experience to play an integral role in the nation's offshore renewable energy industry. In the Gulf, I believe they can be a driving force to realize renewable energy development and a lower carbon future in the offshore Gulf of Mexico. One way is by leveraging the oil and gas industry's expertise in marine operations and industrial fabrication. So our region is well suited to develop offshore wind structures. And the direct access to existing industrial supply chains of the oil and gas industry can contribute to reduce operation and maintenance costs and the cost of fabrications. So now I want to take a few minutes to go over the renewable energy authorization process, including the leasing process. So let me see if I can share my screen and see if that works. So can everybody see that?
Yep, it's popping up.
There we go. And so the process overall is as we've defined it, and all this information can be found on the website below. So on the BOEM Task Force website. And there's 4 stages. Planning and analysis is where we are right now. Leasing, site assessment, and construction and operations plan. And so in the planning and analysis stage, typically this takes 2 years. We have an intergovernmental task force, which we had to kick off. And there's a call for information. Now there is an optional step which we chose to take, which is the request for information to come before the call. And we did that because we opened it up for a broad area. If you go to our website or if you go to the RFI and you look at the map, we decided to look out into the Gulf out to 1,300 meters. So this would include technologies, not only fixed, but floating technologies out to 1,300 meters. Because as Amanda said, we want folks to give the opportunity to be imaginative. I think the Gulf is a special place where there's been a lot of good work done, and industry has come up with great ideas to advance technological development in oil and gas. And I think these opportunities exist in the Gulf. And one of the important things with the RFI is for us to move forward in this whole process is that we need you to publicly comment on the document to say, we think these things are doable in the Gulf and these are the locations where we think they can happen. So we have an aggressive timeline. We talked about having a sale within a couple of years. Well, that's an extremely aggressive timeline, and it can only be done with the contributions from everyone out in the public to tell us where renewable energy is actually feasible in the Gulf of Mexico. So our next step after that will be a call for information. So as Harry said, July 26 is the deadline for comments on the RFI, and BOEM needs to turn around, look at those comments before we can then issue a call. And what you see is a RFI, call for information, area identification. This is a narrowing of a focus to specific areas where in the future BOEM may plan to lease renewable energy. So it's an important process. It takes your involvement for us to be successful and to help us meet an aggressive time frame. And the important thing that goes on, if we get to area identification by the end of the year, then we have to conduct all our NEPA and environmental reviews. And all that has to happen if we're ever to get it to a lease sale in December 22, which is our goal. And so as you can see, so the leasing process itself takes 1 to 2 years. So you're talking about a 4-year process that we pushed down into 2. But again, I think this is doable in the Gulf. I think the task force, and one of the things that we need to do, is get information and data. We want to eliminate conflict use options and find the best locations, not only where we can limit impacts to other operations going on in the Gulf, limit impacts to endangered species, limit impacts to significant sand resources, but also provide the best opportunity to develop wind energy as we move forward. So the leasing process is very similar to the oil and gas process. The names have changed just a little bit. So a proposed notice of sale is now a proposed sale notice for renewable energy. And then we issue a final sale notice instead of a final notice of sale. All those entail public comment that we take into consideration as we move forward. And then finally, we, instead of holding a lease sale, as we call it for oil and gas, we hold an auction for renewable energy. And then of course we sign and issue the lease. And then once the lease is issued, there's a period of site characterization and assessment to make sure what the environment's like in that lease area, put out some meteorological buoys to study the area so that when a company comes in with the construction and operation plan, where this is where they design how the wind turbines are going to be put in place, how the energy is going to be generated, how that energy is going to be brought to shore, set up the fabrication of all that system that will have accurate scientific information for BOEM to be able to make that decision. So that in a nutshell is the process. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and just kind of come to a conclusion. I'll be available to answer any specific questions that you have, but BOEM, we want to facilitate stakeholder outreach with many partners, including the great state of Louisiana. I'm ready to meet with interested parties as necessary. Please, you need to respond to the RFI, as this is the formal process needed to gauge competitive interest in renewable energy and to continue our process on the aggressive timeline that we provided. I'm optimistic we can be successful in our collaboration to share the data and limit use conflict as we move forward, because we have a demonstrated history of working together on coordinating oil and gas development with other uses like fishing and minimizing impacts to endangered species. Of course, there are challenges. Pipelines, do these impact site assessment? Do they impact locations for transmission lines, or are they the conduit for green hydrogen back to shore? Those are things that we're going to have to better understand as we move forward. But given all that, the future of developing offshore renewable energy is bright here in the Gulf of Mexico. We have the industrial know-how for developing energy resources in place and a knowledgeable labor force that will be well suited for ongoing operations. We have the will to tackle any challenges and make this another energy development success as we move toward a more clean energy future for the Gulf, the integrated energy basin. Thanks again for including BOEM today.
Thank you so much, Mike, for walking through the lease process. I think that was very helpful for the audience and I think all of us on this panel. We're going to open it up to Q&A for a little bit, if that is all right. See one comment in the chat from Andre Como. Does the amount of available wind increase as one moves further south away from the coast in Louisiana?
So I will try to address that. And so in the studies that we did with Nrel, the stronger winds are to the west and the winds diminish as you go to east. I believe we took those were at hub heights of 100 meters when we did that analysis. Of course, as at the task force, we also saw some buoy data that actually helps fine tune the wind speed, not the wind speed, but the wind directions. And those are the types of things that we will probably get more information as we move forward. But in general, the winds are greater on the west and they go to the east and not necessarily from the coast to deeper water.
Thanks, Mike. And am I mistaken that at last week's meeting that there was talk about updating wind maps? Or maybe that was a different forum, but just, you know, as part of pulling in information, you know, an update to the wind maps, mapping out the resource is the kind of things that we'll be looking at. And that kind of touches on the second part of the Mr. Como's question about, is there enough wind in state waters to attract investors to state leases? Probably a question better posed to a developer, but you know, we can tee this up for the folks from DNR, but I think that it remains to be seen that there currently aren't any developments in state waters today. But you know, I think as price comes down for offshore wind, as we better understand the resource, there's certainly great potential.
Yeah, I would just add that the wind doesn't know state or federal boundaries, right?
Right.
Really, and I think in general, and Toshara can weigh in here, but I don't think we excluded the analysis just to federal waters. So I think the same general trends would hold, and but clearly that is not a process for BOEM. But I think those are clearly things that I think we can be involved in the discussion. I know that BOEM was instrumental in the Block Island wind farm development. And so we, I think in collecting data and information, I think, we're more than willing to extend that reach into state waters.
That's exactly right. And to answer the third question from Mr. Como, does the state of Louisiana have a lease process? We do in fact have a lease process. We have statutes and regulations on the books, and that is what DNR will be going over in just a few minutes. Any other comments from the public? Yes, we have another one. A few. Let's see. From Tom Wissing, how are we engaging experienced European offshore wind developers? Are there federal efforts on that front?
So yes, but I mean, if Amanda's here and she's willing to answer that question, she has more direct contact working on the Atlantic than I do. But yes, BOEM is engaging internationally on all fronts to better understand best practices and how things have done before. But I will turn it over to Amanda for the correct answer.
That was absolutely correct, as usual, Mike. So BOEM, I would say two main answers, I suppose. One is, yes, we have frequent engagement with offshore wind developers and experienced offshore wind developers in other places. And in fact, many of the active leases in the Atlantic are held by some of those companies and those developers. So as we continue to learn from their experience, can really then build a robust industry in the United States. Additionally, BOEM has an Office of International Affairs in which we have memorandums of understanding and other partnerships with other nations, including Denmark, who has really the most experience with offshore wind and had developed it first, and have a knowledge exchange with them. So as we develop offshore wind here in the United States, we are doing it with building off of those lessons learned from development in other places to ensure that we can really advance this quickly and responsibly in the United States.
And I'd like to add, because that reminded me of something. So when meeting with Norway, one of the things we discussed was how oil and gas and renewables can coexist. And we actually presented from the Gulf of Mexico on our thoughts of how they could actually work well together moving forward.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing those thoughts. Val Brock asks, what practices or processes were used to accelerate Dominion's Coastal Virginia 2-turbine Demonstrator?
I'll actually say that I think that we're going to learn, and in fact, we have learned from that process, and we're applying it to others. So for awareness for everybody, this is the only offshore wind project in federal waters. Is a 2-turbine project that Dominion Energy advanced. They have another project that is a commercial sale project, but utilize this as a pilot. And what we were doing is we were taking the lessons learned from not only that process, but also doing quite a bit of environmental monitoring so that we can see how this development in the Atlantic is changing or not changing habitat, so that as we continue to advance projects, we know what to include within our review process. So it's actually a really terrific pilot project that we're learning both from a process perspective as well as an environmental review perspective, and applying those lessons learned to future projects.
It's exciting to bring those lessons learned and bring them hopefully to Gulf of Mexico. And I apologize, I think I'm going to mispronounce his name. Eoith McGovern asks, hi there, if there's no interest from developers at this stage, will the leasing process still go forward?
That is a great question. And the thing, and this is why in the discussion, I mentioned the need to comment for the RFI. We've seen interest in renewables. We've had companies approach us and talk to us. But for the process to really move forward, we need those interested companies to comment in the RFI so that we can have follow our process, which is critical to moving forward and moving forward in the aggressive time frame that we put forward. So there's definitely interest. We've engaged companies within the region and talked to different groups of people, but it's imperative that they comment on the RFI for us to ensure that we can move forward in a competitive environment.
Yeah, Mike, really well said. And I will just add that, you know, irrespective as to whether or not we advance offshore wind in the Gulf, which I believe we can and we will and we should. And I also will say that I think that the Gulf is really ripe for clean energy more broadly. You know, I don't think we need to, I think offshore wind is a very clear opportunity, and I think we can think about what other opportunities for clean energy transition exists. And Mike talked about a few of them in his remarks. But I think, you know, whether we specifically have a project in the Gulf or not, the region really has, as both Mike and I said, the know-how on OCS energy development. And there's really good examples already of the steel jackets for the Block Island wind farm, which is in Rhode Island waters and state waters. Those are from Louisiana. That's where they were built. And the Dominion ship, the first ever installation vessel, which obviously is going to be a Jones Act compliant ship built right here in the United States, that's being built in Brownsville, Texas. And the steel is coming from Mississippi, Alabama, a few different places. So we're already seeing that the supply chain is going to be, in some cases, it's going to benefit many parts of the country, but in particular, the Gulf really has a great opportunity to be very active in the offshore wind supply chain to help support development in the Atlantic and other regions. So while we need to go full steam ahead to consider opportunities in the Gulf, there's still a really important role for the region to play in the offshore wind development process across the United States.
That's great. And take this opportunity to plug Friday's session, which will be 2 roundtable discussions on the supply chain capacity, past, present, and future in Louisiana. So please sign up and attend that session, same time, 9 a.m. on Friday, if you are interested in learning more about Louisiana supply chain capacity. Kind of related to our supply chain, Aaron Smith asks, Louisiana has more Jones Act jobs than any state in the country. However, the offshore wind industry has proven particularly capable of exploiting Jones Act loopholes and employing foreign mariners at the expense of Louisiana mariners. These developers have found friends in this administration who has refused to enforce the Jones Act as it relates to offshore wind, possibly jeopardizing at least one vessel being built in a Louisiana shipyard. As such, what is being done to ensure that Louisiana vessels and Louisiana mariners are fully utilized from the outset of these projects, these offshore wind projects? It's a tough one.
I'll jump in, Mike. Though you're welcome to add and just say that, I think the president has made it abundantly clear that when he thinks about climate, he thinks about jobs, and we are expeditiously advancing offshore wind responsibly, but expeditiously, not just to fight climate change, but to create good paying jobs. And that means the nearly 80,000 jobs that I've talked about from development, but that also means the robust supply chain that we expect to occur in the United States from advancing offshore wind. And critical to that are going to be the installation vessels, the crew vessels, all of the really necessary marine work in order to support this industry. And we strongly believe that the Jones Act plays a critical role in helping to advance that. The fact is that there are, as we see turbines get bigger and bigger, there aren't enough ships globally to likely meet the demand that we know we're going to need everywhere, including the United States, for installation vessels. So we sure as heck should develop them and build those vessels right here in the United States and continue to ensure that the Jones Act is making that happen. So all to say, I think that's a critical role, incredibly important, and a great opportunity for the United States, and again, in particular, the Gulf region.
Thank you. And I think it brings to mind, if I'm not mistaken, BOEM is working with the Business Network for Offshore Wind on a national supply chain study to help understand what capacities we have, as a nation, from East Coast, West Coast, Gulf Coast, and Great Lakes regions, and everything in the middle to better understand exactly what you stated, Director Lepton, about what capacities we have, and that we're really going to need to ramp up those supply chains and those vessels, in order to meet our ambitious goals for offshore wind development.
Absolutely, and I'll note too that the Department of Energy is also funding similar studies. So there are just great partnerships on this particular issue, and more to come. Thank you for that.
Yes, indeed. If it's all right, we'll just ask a couple more, and then we'll move on to DNR's presentation. Tyler Bergeron asks, how is BOEM working with other federal agencies to modify the leasing process to make it more efficient when other agencies have jurisdiction over a project and require approvals, notices, etc.?
So I think, BOEM, we're working, one of the purposes of the task force is exactly that, is to work with other federal agencies to better understand impacts. I know that they've, on the Atlantic coast, as Amanda had said, with the Virginia lease, the goal is to continuously improve the process. And I can speak that the Biden administration is, one of their goals is to make things more efficient and effective and expand renewable energy, with the goal of 30 gigawatts by 2030. So that is ongoing within the agency. The task force in the Gulf in particular is to share information. So I'm happy to hear if you have suggestions of ways we can improve the process. But I think in the Gulf, we've already moved to make things at least shorter and hopefully more effective as we move forward. As I said, in that time frame, something that was normally 4 years, we've collapsed to 2. And I think in the Gulf, that's especially doable because we have experience of working together and working with federal agencies. And we don't have to build that relationships, they already exist.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, we're excited to leverage your experience and expertise in moving offshore wind forward. And so this will be the last question before we move to our next set of presenters from Andre Como. What is the average rate consumers paid for electricity in Rhode Island before wind energy, and what is it now? How do these compare to average electricity prices being paid now in Louisiana? So that really, it's a pretty specific question. May need to hold this over until the Thursday panel, all about connecting offshore wind farms to users, and we'll have the Public Service Commission, City Council of New Orleans represented, as well as MISO and other developers and Entergy on that panel. But my understanding is that prices were on offshore, on Block Island, energy prices were relatively high, or higher than national average. And so that probably helped in terms of affordability. But Mike, do you have any other comments you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I do not have the specific numbers, but Harry's is correct in his assessment. Is Block Island was getting electricity generation, I believe, from diesel turbines in some way, shape, or form. And, the cost for wind was significantly less. It was clearly above the price point to get electricity generated in the Gulf of Mexico. But that, that was years ago, and the price of per kilowatt of generation of electricity from wind is going down all the time. I do think that is a challenge in the Gulf, and hopefully the experts later in the Wind Week can talk about that in a little more detail. I mean, that has been one of the hesitations, is that there is cheap electricity in the Gulf of Mexico. But I think with the turbine size changes and the other things going on to benefit the Gulf, that when we did the economic study on wind, and that was published this year, but actually started about 2 years ago, there was almost a break-even point for a project that was near the Louisiana, Texas coast. So I do think it is feasible moving forward.
That's exactly right. And I mean, price is going to be critical in moving projects forward and making developments work. So, but thank you for elaborating, Mike. And we'll now, any other questions we'll save to, you can ask your general questions at the end of the session. But next we are going to invite Louisiana Department of Natural Resources Secretary Tom Harris, who is having some technical issues and is joining us by phone. Tom, are you there?
Yes, I am, and thank you, Harry. Good morning, everyone, and I'd like to extend greetings from both myself and the men and women of the Louisiana Department of Natural Resources. I'm glad to be speaking with you today about the opening of what I believe is an exciting new chapter in Louisiana's long and proud history of energy production. And that's the investment and development in the wind industry just off the shores of our state. Louisiana has long been one of the leaders in the nation in providing energy through traditional fuels such as oil and natural gas. And we can continue to be so as our nation and the world get more serious about alternative energy forms, particularly those with the smaller carbon footprint. In fact, I'd make the argument that the technology and expertise developed by the traditional offshore industry will be invaluable to a wind industry looking to get started in an area that's not previously been developed for that purpose. One thing to remember is that significant segments of the wind industry that we hope to encourage will likely depend on the continuation of a robust traditional energy industry. The current offshore oil and gas industry and the infrastructure required to support it are vital to the success of any domestic offshore wind initiatives. Building and maintaining offshore wind farms will require working out of the same ports, using the same road access, the highly specialized vessels, the skilled mariners, and supply chains that are currently made economic by the business generated from the traditional offshore industry. That would also go for the work and expertise to select sites and construct facilities in the offshore environment. Getting an offshore wind industry going will require leaning on a healthy economy of offshore oil and gas support services, supply, and expertise. And we believe that we already possess much of the supporting industry and applicable expertise to help make wind energy projects successful here, from the ports and pipeline infrastructure to geologists and equipment fabrication shops. we're well positioned to support a fledgling wind industry in the Gulf of Mexico by leveraging the transportation, construction, and engineering expertise already associated with our traditional fuel production operations offshore. In its early stages, the offshore wind industry here will need to draw on the expertise and material resources of the offshore oil and gas industry until the wind industry is robust enough to support that economic sector itself. From Louisiana's standpoint, we think all of the pieces are in place to build the wind industry to a point where it becomes a standalone economic engine for energy production and job and investment opportunities. And we've tried to position ourselves to take full advantage. Just last year, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory released study findings that found the Gulf has a lot of advantages for offshore wind development, including shallow warm waters, small average wave heights, and the aforementioned existing oil and gas infrastructure, both physical and economic. An earlier study by the same body estimated that the Gulf of Mexico possesses about 25% of the nation's technical offshore wind energy potential. And Louisiana and Texas are the leading states in the Gulf in terms of wind energy potential, as well as being in the top 5 in the nation for prospective wind energy generation. For DNR, we have several roles to play in helping our state develop its wind energy potential. One of the first things we do is kind of what we're doing here today, connecting and networking with groups and industries interested in investing in projects in our state and our offshore waters. That's one thing we've already been doing, getting the word out that Louisiana is ready to add a new energy source to our portfolio, and that we already have the know-how and the equipment needed to get wind off to a running start. Another role we will have is also one that we've already have experience in, and that's dealing with the potential impacts these wind projects may have on our coastal wetlands. Even projects well off our shores and out into federal waters will need transmission lines and connections that cross through our coastal zone. So our Office of Coastal Management will have to be very involved with the planning of these wind projects and how the lines coming from offshore are run through our vulnerable wetlands. I do feel confident that we'll be able to make a relatively smooth process for wind operators, because when you get down to it, those linear structures won't be much different from the traditional pipeline projects our coastal management staff see regularly. And perhaps the most readily recognized role we play is managing the leasing of state waters for use by wind project operators, managing the acreage out there that different operators might have an interest in, and ensuring the state's fairly compensated for private use of its water bottoms. I can tell you that Louisiana is well on its way to being able to offer a lease sale specific to offshore wind in the Gulf of Mexico. If all goes according to plan, a wind-centered lease sale could occur in the summer of 2023. Though we also have processes in place right now that if a company or investment group has their eyes on a particular area and want to request that it be made available for public bid, we can handle that right now. But for the moment, I want to turn it over to some of our DNR staff who are here today to give you a little more detail on the background of our laws dealing with the regulation and leasing of wind projects, and a fuller description of the process we have set up for nominating acreage for wind leasing and bidding through our state mineral and energy board. Thanks for your participation today, and look forward to hearing more. At this time, I'll turn it over to Jim Devitt or Harry.
Thank you, Secretary Harris. Really are excited that DNR is going to, like BOEM, be able to draw on its existing experience with managing the coastal zone and with oil and gas leasing. So very exciting to be able to draw on that expertise and help expedite projects and move the permitting process forward in a thorough and well thought out way. And so as the Secretary already teed up, we'll now hear from Jim, Devitt, and Gregory Roberts on DNR's leasing process for state lands and waters.
Good morning. I'm Jim Devitt, Deputy General Counsel for DNR. I'm going to give you a brief rundown of the legislative activity in the past dealing with wind leasing of state lands and water bottoms. Act 481 of the 2005 session gave exclusive authority to the State Mineral and Energy Board in conjunction with the Secretary of the Department of Natural Resources to grant leases on state lands and water bottoms for exploration, development, and production of energy from wind. That act was entitled Leases for the Production of Wind Energy. That 2005 regular session legislature enacted sections 1731 through 1733 of Title 41, and it was made effective July 12th of that same year. Since then, a couple of minor changes have been made to those statutes. 1733 was amended in 2008, recognizing a name change for the House Committee having oversight in the matter. And then in 2009, it was amended to recognize a name change of the State Mineral Board to the State Mineral and Energy Board. Other than these, the statutes have remained essentially unchanged since enactment in 2005. In February of 2008, the Department of Natural Resources promulgated Title 43, Part 5, Chapter 10 in the Louisiana Administrative Code. It was entitled Leasing State Lands, Water Bottoms for Exploration, Development, and Production of Wind Energy. These were re-promulgated in September of 2015, mostly for reorganization and renumbering. Chapter 10 was changed to Chapter 7 of the same title. These regulations have remained essentially unchanged as well since 2005. Since the publication of those rules, the Office of Mineral Resources has received some inquiries over the years about wind energy leasing of a couple of projects. One such was made in 2010 pertaining to a potential project in Southwest Louisiana. No companies ever followed up with nominating state acreage for a project though. However, this year, Mineral Resources has received notice of interest earlier this year for a potential offshore project. Thus far, no proposed nomination capable of evaluation by the staff has been received, but we're hopeful. Currently, the staff is working on finalizing an official state wind lease in anticipation of a public sale. There are a few more internal reviews which need to take place, but it's expected that this form will be ready for presentation and approval by the Mineral Board soon. The nomination and bid process for obtaining a state wind lease will now be reviewed by our Petroleum Lands Director, Gregory Roberts.
All right, thank you, Jim. So in a general sense, the state wind lease acquisition process follows relatively closely to the oil and gas nomination and bid process. There are, however, a few caveats or things that prospective lessees will need to pay attention to in the state regulations that Jim previously mentioned, Act 4310 specifically. So what I'll do is just go over the 9 general steps somewhat briefly on a high level. And then if there's any follow-up questions, please, I'll take care of those in the Q&A, or you can email me directly. My email is greg.roberts@la.gov. And if I don't have the answer for you, I'll track it down and find it. So anyway, step 1 in the nomination and bid process is registration. All parties wishing to apply for a state wind lease must register with the Office of Mineral Resources, and that registration must be renewed annually by January 31st. So step 2, 2 and 3 are very similar to the oil and gas lease process. Step 2 being pre-nomination research. Prospective lessees must conduct research prior to nomination to determine and verify whether state lands fall in one of the following 6 categories. So are state lands on wildlife and fishery lands, school board indemnity lands, tax adjudicated lands, vacant state lands, are they in White Lake, or any legal areas. Prospective lessees must conduct research prior to nomination to determine and confirm whether state lands are available for lease. So have the state lands been designated by the State Mineral and Energy Board to be out of commerce? Is the land subject to an active agreement? If so, lessees must provide an affidavit confirming that the parties to the active agreement have been notified of the proposed wind lease. So once pre-nomination research has been concluded, prospective lessees will schedule a pre-nomination meeting with the Office of Mineral Resources for a full list of items that need to be brought to the pre-nomination meeting. Please refer to Act 43-1011D specifically for that list. Examples of things that we would need would be legal description, map. There's a $400 processing fee per nomination. Those are just a few. So please familiarize yourself with 43-1011D for the remainder of the list. Let's see, there are some other restrictions in the nomination process that the prospective lessees must adhere to. So we need specific XY coordinates based on the Louisiana coordinate system of 1927. Leases are to be restricted in size. Each lease must maintain can have a maximum of 5,000 acres per lease. Okay, so on to step 4, examination and evaluation of the nomination. So once you've had your pre-nomination meeting and you've put in the nomination, the Office of Mineral Resources will examine and evaluate that nomination. The pre-nomination meeting will, by the Office of Mineral Resources, will decide that all legal, procedural, and technical requirements have been met. We will place the nominated track on the Mineral and Energy Board's Evaluation Committee's agenda for the next regularly scheduled board meeting. We will take the area out of commerce and transmit a copy of prospective lessee's application, property description, and plat to Wildlife and Fisheries, they'll review it and certify to the board whether there are other leases in the area. OMR will transmit the nomination and recommend to the Secretary of the Department of Natural Resources for evaluation. The Secretary will determine whether the proposed lease is appropriate and will recommend to the board whether it should or should not conduct a public bid. The board, through the Office of Mineral Resources, will then notify the prospective lessee of the Secretary's recommendation. Okay, when we get to step 5, advertisement of nominations, here's where there is a major difference between the oil and gas process and the wind energy process. That being that prior to advertisement, the House Committee on Natural Resources and Environment and the Senate Committee on Natural Resources must approve the minimum dollar amount for a bonus, and they must also approve the minimum percentage of revenue, which will be known as the electric power production royalty prior to nomination. And you can see Act 41, 1733D specifically for more detail on that. Once approval has been obtained by the Senate and House committees, the Office of Mineral Resources will publish the advertisement and request for bids not more than 120 days and not less than 60 days prior to the date set for the public bid opening. A list of everything that will be contained in the advertisement can be seen in 4310-15B. See that for a specific list. Step 6, the submission of bids. Registered bidders will submit sealed bids in the form required by the Office of Mineral Resources. Bids must be submitted on the entirety of the acreage advertised no later than 12 o'clock on Tuesday immediately prior to the Wednesday lease sale. So that's very similar to the oil and gas process. See Act 4310-17C for a list of what's required in the bid package. Step 7, examination of the bids. Sealed bids will be publicly opened and read aloud here in the LaSalle building in Baton Rouge. So unlike the oil and gas process where here's another change. So the board will defer action on the bid until at least the next regularly scheduled board meeting, but no later than 100 days, pending examination and evaluation of the bids by the Office of Mineral Resources staff for compliance with the legal, procedural, and technical requirements. So time will be taken to review those bids, and they won't be, at least won't be awarded at that meeting. It will be awarded at the next regularly scheduled board meeting or no later than 100 days. Step 8, award of the state wind lease. At the next regularly scheduled board meeting, OMR staff will present to the board in executive session a technical briefing on the merits of the bid. So we'll go over the legal, procedural, and technical requirements that are called for in 4310 and make a recommendation to the board in executive session. Once back in open session, the board will publicly announce the staff's recommendation, and then the board will announce its decision. Information as to the bids and awards will be published online. Step 9, issuance, the last step, issuance and execution of the lease. Within 24 hours of being awarded, the lease and lessee is required to pay to OMR the entirety of the designated bonus and administration fee of 10% of the bonus. Upon receipt of both the bonus and administration fee, OMR will prepare, circulate, and record the lease. That's about it for all of the steps. Like I said, that was very brief overview. Feel free to reach out to me directly, greg.roberts@la.gov, and I'd be happy to go over that in a little more detail and answer any questions you might have. Back to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Greg and Jim and Secretary Harris. I think it's really critical to that we've been having such great coordination between BOEM and DNR in the state to really capture those efficiencies as we're developing, as developers are trying to identify where to lease and where those wind lease areas are, because as Secretary mentioned, laying transmission lines through the coastal zone, we can minimize those impacts and capture co-benefits by reducing overall costs for that transmission infrastructure the state and federal government win, as well as the people and the developers. So we're going to hold Q&A until after Secretary Pearson shares his remarks, because I believe he needs to run after those remarks. So short tee up, but thank you, Secretary Pearson, for being on today. We've already spoken a lot about the economic development potential of offshore wind, and so we're very appreciative to have you here to provide the sector-specific focus on economic development potential.
Hey, my pleasure, and thank you. Really appreciate the efforts of Mike Salata, certainly Director Amanda Lefton, and all the way up to the leadership of Secretary Gina Rinaldo. That's our backyard, where this 30 megawatt operating wind production facility has been in place since 2016. And so while we're looking at this new frontier here at the Gulf of Mexico, it really feels like all the pieces are in place for Louisiana to be a best in practices, world-class leadership opportunity for wind energy production. And I say that in that sort of maybe one of the next steps people could consider is a wind tour beyond just having Wind Week here. And where I'd like to point to as one of the stops on that tour is we're not new to this whole sector. In 2008, I went to Southampton to visit a company called Blade Dynamics. It should be thought about that the production of blades has a great deal to do with the high-tech masts that were a part of the sailing industry, particularly the racing industry, as they try to get those long and light structures put together. And that's one of the key efficiencies that we're seeking today in wind production, a longer and stronger blade. All of this comes back to that company did locate here in Louisiana. They're co-located with NASA on the Michoud facility right outside New Orleans, where they run research and development. Blade Dynamics was acquired by GE and today operates under the umbrella of a massive company called LM Wind. So a lot of the seeds of what's taken place in the industry has its DNA right here in Louisiana. And working these blades, certainly that's around composites, advanced manufacturing. It's another one of our strengths. You need only look at, again, the Michoud campus there and see Boeing constructing the Space Launch System and Lockheed Martin putting together the Orion space capsule. And you'll see that we're involved in these highly advanced manufacturing opportunities. So whether it comes back to the nacelles that house the generator for wind energy, the blades, the tower structures, the transmission lines, all of that are things that we have capacity for here. I love hearing how it was demonstrated in the field off Block Island. And again, just demonstrates what's possible once we get past these very important environmental and lease and setting the stage for the full development of wind energy. And that's where you'll see the economic development component come forward. That's been mentioned that there's thousands of jobs available in this type of activity. That's absolutely correct. We've demonstrated that we can manage that quite well here in Louisiana. So I'm really pleased to see this emerging theme here today, that in all the elements that we've talked about, there is so much capacity, capability, and potential here in Louisiana. And, we stand ready to exercise against that. We've got some great programs in terms of economic development incentives for the manufacturing elements here that can have tax abatement, can have payroll rebates and workforce training. We have the best workforce training program in the nation called LED Fast Start. So we're ready, and we'll just await that moment when we can begin to exercise against not just the important engineering and environmental elements of this, but move into production and see that capacity generated. And hopefully there'll be a lot of work here in Louisiana, and certainly a lot of work beyond our boundaries as we lead the state and the nation in this new endeavor.
Thank you so much, Secretary Pearson. We have enjoyed the governor's office working with you and Undersecretary Brad Lambert, who's been really fantastic to work with on offshore wind. And he'll be moderating a panel on Friday looking at the supply chain opportunities and capabilities. So we're excited for that panel. I know you need to run it in about 5 minutes, but I wanted to follow up. If you could just elaborate on what LED Fast Start is, because it's such a fantastic program, as you mentioned, rated #1 in the nation. And do you mind elaborating for just the audience to just explain sort of the potential and how it can be used?
No, I'm excited to do that. And certainly as we move into more and more technically based companies, the skill sets required of the workforce move in that same direction. And the traditional workforce development is certainly a key component here, but it really begins with the recruitment, the identification of people that are well suited to do this type of work, to do some preliminary review and testing to make sure that the skill sets are available in the universe of folks that have been identified for employment, doing some pre-employment training, and then taking the specific trainings and copywriting that and making that available to that specific company so that on day one, they can feel comfortable that whether they're going to be involved in the structural formation of the tower anchoring systems, or if they're going to have people that are working the composites to actually build blades, or whatever those skill sets might require, that we've done a very thorough job of building the components to make sure that we can do that. And so it'll happen in some classroom settings. It'll happen on tablets. We've even been putting together augmented reality and virtual reality components, wearing a set of goggles so that some places that are hard to visit or dangerous to visit, we can actually put a person into that kind of environment safely and do the training there. So really from all aspects, we've got a very cutting edge system out there that brings together all the elements necessary to deliver an outstanding workforce to a company on day one. And that's an existing company. Maybe there's new job opportunities and things that they want to build, but haven't ventured in that direction yet. We work with not only newly recruited companies to Louisiana, but our existing foundational companies as well.
Thank you, Secretary Pearson. It's a huge tool in our toolbox that is just very valuable for existing and future businesses located here in Louisiana. So appreciate your work, and I know you need to run in just a moment. Any questions for Secretary Pearson? Just probably one, only time for one if there are any, and then we'll open it up to just general comments or questions.
While we're waiting for anyone that may want to submit something, we can also get back to you if it's of a technical nature. But again, thank you to the leadership. And I do want to issue that standing invitation when the time is right to conduct a wind tour here in Louisiana.
I think that's a great idea. Happy to work with you on that and really kind of as we think through what's next after Wind Week, how do we continue to convene stakeholders, the public, other agencies and governments. I think that sounds like a great plan. Get out into the field and see exactly what we're talking about.
And we can include our Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, certainly our Water Institute of the Gulf, and a lot of very relatable elements that we're providing leadership with here in Louisiana.
It all pieces together, and it's just is part of our more comprehensive working coast that we have here in Louisiana that's kind of unique to the nation, and just the how existing stakeholders and users of the Gulf of Mexico coexist, cooperate, and work together to ensure that everybody can find their use and fully, whether it's oil and gas, fishing, coastal restoration protection, and now offshore wind, among others, that there's room enough for everybody if we work together and communicate early to avoid those conflicts.
Very exciting times. Thanks for your leadership, Harry. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate it. It's been great. And so with that, we'll any questions from the audience or our panelists, if you have questions of each other. Really, while we're waiting, I have a technical question. So Greg went over that the maximum size of a lease is 5,000 acres in state waters. Mike or Trishara, is there a size limit on leases in federal waters for wind?
No. Generally, that's, we rely on the RFIs and the calls to try to design a wind area. We're trying to make a minimum size and for amount of gigawatts, and I don't have that information. I don't know if Trishara remembers that, but I don't think there's a requirement for a certain size lease.
There's not, but we're looking at, it takes about 80,000 acres for 1,000 gigawatt wind farm.
80,000 acres for 1,000 gigawatt or megawatts?
Megawatts, yes, sorry, megawatts.
Gotcha.
Mhm.
Okay. No, just be, I think, important as developers try to think through their approach to both federal waters and state waters, just kind of recognizing the differences in the leasing processes and how to match it up. And I think through our ongoing coordination, is just one way to ensure that it is easiest on developers, and that we'll continue to work together and kind of move things forward.
Harry, there were some Q&As in the queue.
Oh,
and
sorry, I was missing that. If you,
I answered 3 that from a federal perspective. I typed in an answer for 3 of them, but there were a few other questions there as well.
okay.
And Harry, if I could just real quick, just to add on to the 5,000 acre maximum. So that's just put in place 5,000 acre maximum per nomination. So obviously if a potential developer had a need or was interested in more acreage than that, they could submit multiple nominations to add on to their block. I think the maximum restriction is really just a mechanism put in place by the state just to protect our interests and guard against maybe someone holding on to more acreage than they might necessarily need for a potential project, and which would, limit other developers from coming in and developing that state land. So I just wanted to clarify that it's multiple, if you needed more than 5,000 acres, you need to do multiple nominations.
Thank you for clarifying that, Greg. Appreciate it. And thanks, Mike, I wasn't looking in the Q&A, I was just looking in the chat. So thanks for bringing that to my attention. So Margie Vicnair-Prey asks, you speak of new technologies. Will alternative wind technologies be considered above non-traditional, as in something other than fan turbines?
So, I mean, I can try to answer that. I didn't want to answer that because I'm not sure there's a clear answer. I think the request for information is to provide us what those options companies are interested in pursuing. And then from there, we can analyze, what the companies present. So if wind technology is all that's provided, then that's what we'll pursue. If they're also pursuing wind or they're looking at green hydrogen, and then, those are decisions yet to be made. Maybe they won't overlap in the same area, maybe they will. But I think in general, all of them are rely on some sort of wind turbine to generate those types of energy sources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that certainly seems to be the leader in the technology in terms of cost and effectiveness. But this is a rapidly evolving sector and technology, and so excited to see what people offer BOEM in terms of their request for information, and just as the conversation and the technology improves, we can develop kind of projects, pilots potentially for evaluating newer technologies as well. There's another question. Did Nrel's wind study measure local anomalies in wind density due to thermals caused by Mississippi River and other significant river flows?
So so the only time that the Mississippi River is mentioned in the study as relation to thermal energy conversion technologies. I don't know whether that answers the question or actually what the study says in detail. We would, we can follow up on that in a little more detail, but I think that is an accurate answer. So if the question is trying to get at something a little different, then I would say, if it was just about wind energy, then I would have to say the answer is no.
I can also provide a link to the study in the chat for all panelists and attendees for the Nrel study.
That'd be great. And for this anonymous attendee, if you have information, it sounds like something that BOEM would certainly appreciate having if you submit it through their RFI process.
Absolutely. Thanks.
Matthew Holland asked, what types of incentive subsidies exist to encourage developers? Will wind energy in the Gulf be subject to state severance taxes? Perhaps Greg or Jim could touch on the royalty or severance tax component for state waters.
Go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, that's something that I don't have the answer to right now, as far as if severance taxes would need to be paid. I don't know that we've covered that yet, but that's something that we can look into. Jim might have some information.
I don't know of severance taxes on wind energy, but it's something that we can certainly look into and make sure about. The incentives, it's such a new it's such a new industry for us. We're learning a lot on how to work with this this type of development, and I'm sure that's something we'd be willing to consider.
Yeah, I don't know if Secretary Pearson might have had some more information to give on that as far as incentives for economic development go, but
certainly, and yeah, he touched on the Louisiana Fast Start program, and Secretary Pearson can. I don't want to speak for him on the details of how certain tax incentives like the R&D, research and development tax incentive, the industrial tax exempt program, angel investor taxes, that are not specifically designed for wind energy, but potentially could be utilized depending on meeting certain requirements. And just to clarify, so the severance tax is different than the royalty that would be negotiated, and that would be a negotiated. There is no set royalty percentage. That's what would be negotiated in state water, for state leases, and then go to the Senate and House committees. Is that right?
That's right. Yes, severance taxes and the royalty amount are two separate things. I don't know if the state would have a severance tax on wind energy. And yes, the royalty amount. Right now it's written into statutes and state regulations that the Senate and House committees must approve the minimum royalty. And I think, the reason for that, it's a new industry, unlike oil and gas, which has been, developed in this country and in Louisiana for over 100 years. We're comfortable with the market, and we know what the market rates are in that industry. with wind energy being so new, I think that is really just a safety mechanism to protect the state and state lands, so that we make sure that we take the time necessary to understand and negotiate the best price available for the state, so that the state can take advantage of any economic benefits that are out there for us. So, I don't know exactly why it was put in, but that's kind of my thoughts on it, and the benefit that it has in going to those committees.
Now that gets to Margie McNair's praise, kind of follow-up question about it being more complex than the oil and gas process and needing House and Senate approval. One thing I'd like to note, though, do those committees typically meet outside of legislative session? Just thinking through the timing of kind of getting a lease approved, would you have to wait till the next legislative session typically, or or can the committees call a special meeting?
They do meet from time to time outside of the session, and I think they do try to accumulate topics that they need to discuss. But this minimum, I think, could stand for quite a long time. It would be something that our staff would consider and recommend to the board and to those legislative committees as a base level, if you will. So I don't think it would need to be done for every lease.
Yeah, I think Jim, you're probably right. I mean, it's something that once that precedent is set, it would I would assume be a go forward. But being that we haven't had wind developed on state waters yet, or in state waters yet, to me it's just a safety mechanism to make sure that all the proper reviews being done and people have their chance to weigh in and make sure that we protect the state of Louisiana and in our economic interests.
Thank you for that. I will note in the chat that Anthony Bowden with GNO Inc. provided a link with economic development incentives, primarily structured around new job creation and new capital investments. So please check out that link. And thank you, Anthony, for sharing that. Going down the list, Woodrow Parker just comments, I think more education on workshops should be in place, certainly. And we'll look forward to working with you on that and continuing this conversation, bringing more information to bear, and just having a follow-up forum for some to answer some of these really good questions.
Yeah, from the state side, I would definitely agree with that. It's a new industry, and we look forward to being here to work with people and help developers to grow in Louisiana and for us to grow along with them.
There are a couple of questions about who's responsible for building out transmission, and whether it's the developers and the local utilities. I'm going to defer that question to Thursday's panel, where we'll have the experts so I don't put my foot in my mouth, and we'll let the experts answer that one. All of these sessions are going to be recorded, so if you're unable to attend that panel, just check back after Wind Week and we'll have it uploaded. You can go to the same place that you registered for this panel, and you'll be able to find the recorded sessions. Let's see. There's a question from Tom Wissing. Are current leases inclusive of R&D and decommissioning? Has there been any discussion about variable leasing rates, altering rates based on operational capacity? Mike, I don't know if you, from the federal perspective, want to jump in. I'm not.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, decommissioning is included in the leasing process. I mean, that is a requirement, just like with oil and gas. R&D generally is not really part of our oil and gas leasing process historically. You know, the operators do that on their own. I don't know if there's anything specific in the leases around renewables. And I don't know the answer to the next question. And I don't know if Tashara does. Otherwise, you know, we can get that answer about the variable lease rates.
Yes, we'll have to follow back up on that.
And I'm sharing, thank you for that. I'm sharing Anthony Bowden's link and comment with all our attendees as well. So that is now in the chat for those interested in learning more about the incentives around new job creation and new capital investments. There's a follow-up question from Matthew Holland. Following up on the question on royalties, does the Natural Resources Committee have to approve each proposal, or do they only set a minimum royalty amount? Sounds like, Jim, you answered that it's just setting the minimum royalty amount and not every lease needing to go through committee, legislative committee.
I've just had a moment to glance at the statute.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would recommend Matthew and any others who are interested in it, look at 41:1733 Part D. And I'm not going to give you a legal opinion on it, but it is what it is. So
Okay.
I'm not, we've never done this before. So that process is probably yet to be determined, I would think.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Well, a good question. And, you know, I think working with our legislative committees on that moving forward as interest is shown in developing in state waters, we stand ready to continue to move things forward and clarify the process.
Yeah.
All right. I'm not seeing any additional, I think we kind of touched on a lot of the other questions, but any of the panelists, if you see one that we missed or if you have any questions for each other or kind of additional comments that you'd like to share, we don't need to go all the way up to 11. And if there are no other questions or comments, we can end early, but wanted to make that clear. So David Becker asks, I thought severance taxes for non-renewable resources. Wind is a renewable resource, so why would there be severance tax? And
I think that's a Department of Revenue question. But yeah, I think the traditional severance tax has to do with minerals that are in the ground. That's the archetypical severance tax resource. But I'll leave that for the tax experts to answer.
very good.
As to decommissioning, I will say that our lease is going to be considering decommissioning, at least in the form it's in right now, the draft form that it's in right now. I think that was an earlier question.
Mm-hmm. What about, so we haven't touched on this, but kind of both for state and federal leases, you know, kind of co-locating within an existing oil and gas lease. Are there, I've heard, you know, a lot of folks raise this as a possible opportunity, whether it's building out wind turbines on existing decommissioned platforms, or kind of side by side within the same lease area. Is there a clear process for how that would work, or is that something that still would need to be
No, there isn't. There's we haven't received proposals for that yet, but it certainly would be an interesting proposition to consider.
Mm-hmm. And so on the state side, I forget which step it is, but looking at existing leases in a proposed area, would look at, existing oil and gas leases, for example. But there isn't necessarily, just because there isn't an existing oil and gas lease, that it would prohibit an overlaying wind lease, or would it kind of necessarily prohibit it at all?
Right. And that's certainly something that we consider in traditional oil and gas leases. For instance, our standard state lease form. This is in the general area of correlative rights. If co-lessees of state lands can coexist, we try to encourage that. Our current state lease form, for instance, says if there's a coastal restoration project that needs to happen, that the oil and gas lessee will cooperate with that project to allow it to happen. And so it's not unusual. It's something we've come across in a lot of different areas. I think, as Mike might have mentioned earlier, we anticipate there being a lot of pipeline activity coexisting with a wind farm, just because of the where they're going to be. So we'll have to see how that works out.
And on the federal side, I mean, we have an alternate use regulation. I think it's 585J for the, and so there are procedures to file or right of use and easement on an existing platform if that is to be developed for a different use, including a wind turbine. And likewise, we have the ability to share sites or leases. I think in the Gulf, however, as more development moves to deep water, I think there is clearly more open space on the shelf and an opportunity where they can coexist, but they don't have to overlap necessarily, at least the platforms. Clearly, pipelines are something that we're going to have to work through.
Great points. Not seeing any other questions right now. So I will take the opportunity to just tee up the remaining schedule of the week. So tomorrow we will be focusing the conversation on minimizing potential environmental impacts, primarily focusing on aquatic and avian species, but certainly not exclusively. If there are others that we need to talk about, we certainly can raise them, and that's the forum to do that. Wednesday, we will have a similar panel, but not looking at the resources themselves, but really engaging existing users in the Gulf of Mexico and understanding their concerns. Thursday, as we mentioned, we'll have a conversation about connecting offshore wind to end users, which we're very excited about. And then Friday, we will wrap it up with 2 roundtable discussions looking at existing and future supply chain capacity. You can sign up for those sessions at the same place you signed up for this one on the governor's website. We really hope you can continue to participate in Wind Week. And I think that is, unless there's a new question since I shared my screen, I think that is, we are about to wrap up. I think the board is.
Thank you for the invitation. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you for all your participation. Thank you, Mike, Jim, Greg, Trishara. Thank you for being on this panel. Thank you to Director Lefton, Secretary Harris, and Secretary Pearson for their participation as well. I thought this was a rich discussion, and I think helped to demystify the leasing process, both in state and federal waters, recognizing that these processes are in place, and but that we have a lot to lean on in terms of our experience with oil and gas leasing, but that there's some new opportunities and new challenges, more nuances with respect to wind leasing that we'll have to work through as we go through this process and as developers identify their interest or state their interest, and we start to work through the process. So thank you all again. I appreciate it. Thank you to all our attendees, and y'all have a great day and hope to see you tomorrow.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.